First of all, thank you, Robin, for organising this event. I think it's quite important that remind ourselves of how, as Robin put it, political courage can actually achieve great things. Whilst listening to the first part that Robin spoke, and the fact that the British establishment was very pro-Serb, I really only noticed this when I became the representative for Slovenia in the United Kingdom. I had a phone call from what in the UK used to be called the Special Branch. The Special Branch was a unit of the police which looked out for terrorism and political problems that might come to the country from outside. And I received a phone call from a policeman, and he said, basically, I'm here to make sure that you are safe. I really was quite surprised at this. You know, was I in danger just because I was representing Slovenia and Slovenian independence? And I said, well, okay. He said, you have to remember, and this was a sort of his reflection on an establishment position. He said, you have to remember there are 40,000 people of Serbian background in the United Kingdom. You only need one lunatic to come and kill you. That, in a way, was a bit of a shock, I must say. I of course, ignored it. And he handed over 2 special booklets that the police gave to people, diplomats and the like. One was on personal protection and the other was on office protection. So Robin reminded me of that when he mentioned about Serbs being very influential. The second thing which he drew to my memory was when I dealt with the Foreign Office in the United Kingdom, I quickly realized that there were 2 strands of thought within the Foreign Office. One was what you might call the decolonization element, which basically said the right of people for self-determination should be aided and helped by the diplomats and the country, and people now should take charge of their own affairs. And that was what you might call a very liberal branch within the British Foreign Office. The other part of the British Foreign Office were Cold War warriors. They basically saw everything through the spectrum of a struggle, a worldwide struggle against Soviet communism. And when you think of those 2, you realize why, wrongly, of course, they said the breakup of Yugoslavia is a very bad thing because it might cause problem in the Soviet Union, and we never know what may happen with that, chaos, war, and so on. So Robin reminded me of that, and obviously my efforts were directed towards the part of the Foreign Office that supported self-determination. So those 2 things came to mind from Robin's earlier speech. I don't really want to dwell too much on the economic factors because I think most people know those. The struggle that Margaret Thatcher had to reduce trade union power. In a recent speech in Budapest, Robin referred to that as a style of syndicalism, so that they exercise too much undemocratic power. What I would like to mention, because I worked at the Institute of Economic Affairs for 3 years, and was alongside Ralph Harris in particular. And I became aware of how the thoughts of the Institute had a profound effect on probably, I think it was a sort of sea change. Mrs. Thatcher was trying to find a way, as Robin described it, to reverse this ratchet effect, to take the Conservative Party away from this acceptance of any socialist measure that had been put in place by a previous administration. And therefore, one needed to move to dismantle this situation. She was very close to a man called Keith Joseph. Keith Joseph, in fact, was the candidate to take over from Edward Heath as Prime Minister. Keith Joseph was a highly intellectual man, very well educated. He came from a commercial background in his family, so he understood the free market, he understood capitalism. But he, almost at the last minute, decided, I'm not the person for this job. And in a strange way, it was luck that there standing beside him was Margaret Thatcher, and she stepped into the breach and became the candidate. So it was not a drive by her at that time to say, I must be the Prime Minister. She showed her political courage to say, someone has to pick up this situation. And to the surprise of everyone, she became leader of the Conservative Party. Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher became very friendly towards the Institute of Economic Affairs, mainly because, and this was mentioned earlier, the Institute had been founded by Hayek. They were very dedicated to individual rights, individual responsibilities, individual initiatives, private capital, and so on. And they they were founded, I think, 1955 or 1956. So they had a huge body of research showing where the economy could improve, could be made better by changing certain things. And Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher picked up on this research. They then established a particular party think tank called the Centre for Policy Studies, and they were helped by another IEA person called Nigel Vinson. It was no surprise that when she became Prime Minister, two of the first people she ennobled and sent to the House of Lords were Lord Harris, Ralph Harris, and Lord Vinson, Nigel Vinson. She wanted their voices in the upper house. The other interesting thing to learn from Ralph Harris was that she was a person of high intellect. We don't really dwell on that, but she had a degree from Oxford. I think it was chemistry, wasn't it? And then later on, because that would have restricted her family life, she then studied law and became a barrister. So a really remarkable intellect this person was. Plus, one learned that two things. Number one, she worked hard, she studied everything, she wanted to know the detail. And that was a challenge to a civil service and probably to other ministers, which I think Robin referred to, that they better know their stuff, otherwise they'd be in trouble, because she probably knew it better than them. Just sudden thought comes to me. Once at the IEA, her husband, Dennis Thatcher, came to lunch, and we were curious about how he functioned with the Prime Minister. And so after a little bit of sort of small talk, someone said, Mr. Thatcher, does Mrs. Thatcher seek your advice? He then said, oh, no, she doesn't need my advice. She's perfectly capable. She'd absolutely. And then someone else said, never? Did she never get your advice? And he said, well, I remember once we were sitting in the flat above 10 Downing Street, and she was working through this pile of government papers, and she was looking rather strangely at one paper, and she threw it across to me. And she said, Dennis, what do you make of this? He said, I took one look at it, and I said, Margaret, load of rubbish. And I threw it back to her. And then someone else in the group said, and what did she do? He said she wrote on it, load of rubbish, and sent it back to the civil service. So what did that show? That showed that she knew the subject, that she was decisive. She was not going to take any nonsense that appeared before her. And I think both John and Robin illustrated that as well. The whole Hayek background, she in a way, I feel personally similar, because I come from a fairly modest family background, and she came from, lived above the shop in Grantham, and I think we both, I've never asked her this, by the way, but I think we both sort of came to Hayek by experience. She saw the problems of rationing in the Second World War for a small business. She saw what that meant for families. I came to it through my work as a professional accountant. You learn about how businesses operate, how businessmen think, how government regulation can be so negative for a business and send them the wrong way. So when I realized that she'd picked up on Hayek, I'd almost picked up on Hayek at a similar time, and von Mises as well. The other thing which my experience, which might interest you at the Institute of Economic Affairs, was the relationship between Ralph Harris and Margaret Thatcher. And I saw this in two ways. One, correspondence, but the other at a personal level. She had high respect for Ralph, but he had this huge ability to contradict her, and she was happy to hear his contradiction. She was not going to shut him up. She wanted to hear that. So he had this innate ability to have a genuine debate about an important subject. And that you could see that was very powerful in the way she would analyze a subject. By contrast, who was the sort of greater economic writer and so on, Arthur Selden. Arthur Selden couldn't do that. He could write the most brilliant stuff in pamphlets and books and so on. But he had a very challenging way to speak to people, and that you could see that Margaret Thatcher reacted to that. She reacted negatively to that because it was as if saying, Mrs. Thatcher, you don't know what you're talking about. And she didn't like that. So you could see how that sort of chemistry was working. The other thing that, as we know, this ratchet effect that she was undoing, she did not have in her mind when she became Prime Minister this subject called privatization. She never used the word, I think, had ever used the word privatization before she became Prime Minister. But in saying we've got to reverse this, how do you reverse a state-owned industry? How do you return it to well, you've got to get rid of it, haven't you? You've got to push it out, you've got to sell it. And if anyone wants to, is interested here to read that, there's a good book called Selling the State by a good Australian economist called Cento Veljanovsky. His father was Macedonian. That tells you how this came about. And one of the stories in that is interesting because I think it was the first, was it not British Telecom? Post Office Telephones was the first one that was privatised. And what happened was they made a profit. And the Treasury said, oh, that's very good. You've made, I don't know, £50 million profit. Can we have a dividend of half that? And they said, no, sorry, you can't. We haven't got the money. In fact, we want another 100 million from you to modernise the system. And that, in a way, showed the problem of state ownership. State ownership could only get capital by taxing the people, whereas private ownership gets it from the market. And therefore, they had no alternative at that time. They didn't want to put taxation was actually start to sell it off. And that was a story all through privatisation. You were taking actually a burden off the state, even with a company that was making some money. But many of the companies weren't making any money. You were taking a burden off the state and returning it to an area of risk capital and actually saying you had to be efficient. The other thing that was at one dinner at the Institute of Economic Affairs, I remember, and this shows something that I think Robin mentioned. She had a very good feel, a very good human feel, and a very good political instinct. Arthur Selden, that I mentioned earlier, suddenly challenged her in the middle of the lunch and said, Mrs. Thatcher, you are not modernising and improving and bringing private action into the National Health Service. Just at that moment, walking past the window of the Institute was a workman in ordinary working clothes. He'd probably been painting somewhere. And she said, Mr. Selden, do you see that man there? He relies on the health service. I am going to be very careful before I do anything rash in relation. So this was, she knew something had to be done, but she was going to be very careful before she did that. And it told you how her political instinct was and how she had a relationship with a man in the street. Literally, he was the man in the street at that moment. The other thing I remember at that lunch, and this shows how she did her homework. She must have really prepared herself for this lunch. There were 4, what we call in English, captains of industry. There was the chairman of British Petroleum. There was the chairman of IBM UK. There was the chairman of ICI. And then I think the other one was Rio Tinto. Really enormous mega businesses. And to see this lady, this politician, any politician would have surprised me, but to see her speak to each of those highly respected, highly successful businessmen on their level about their business, and they knew that she knew what she was talking about, was startling in a way. But it did say she must have really done a lot of homework before she entered into conversation. Now, John and Robin may know how she did that sort of homework, but it was really, for me, I was right at the end of the table, sitting here in wonderment, I may say, but that was really startling. If we go back to the Ratchet effect, perhaps the most important thing in the Ratchet effect was, and I may say we have that problem at the moment, but it is saying that trades unions cannot determine solely on their own where the country is going in any way. And one of the early booklets of the IEA explained in the history of the trade union movement how the trade union movement had actually being the place where workers got unemployment pay, where they got sick pay, where they got holiday pay, before that became law nationally. So they were welfare organizations, and as a result of that, the early trade union law gave them the same rights as charities. As those things were taken over by the state, the trade unions were left only with trying to get more pay and be involved in political action. So being a part welfare organization to be in more political action was highly negative for what had developed, and they were, I would say, abusing the power that they had. In the end, she solved that problem, and trade unions became much more interested in the success of the business that they were in, that they would make money, and making money was good for the business. It would expand, it would provide more employment, and so on. However, what has happened, she, I suppose, never really thought, and again, John and Robin may answer the question, but it seems to me she never thought that she would have a great worry about what we call the public sector unions. Because we now have a situation where the public sector unions are almost wielding wrongly power within the state, and we need Mrs. Thatcher to deal with that so that they become more responsible. In the public sector, since COVID, productivity has been flat. Despite modern technology and so on, it's been flat. The ability for people in the public sector to say I'm working from home is very high. Where I live, and there's a number of public sector workers, I promise you, go to the park on a Friday and you'll see many of these workers working from home. Go to the golf club and you'll see many working from home. I promise you. It's so clear. The car park in the local station is half empty. It's the best time for me to go to London, I have to say, so she would know that she had to deal with that. What struck me thinking about this is that she really grew in the job, and she got better and better and better at the job. One of the consequences was this, of course, that her lesser colleagues didn't like that, and in the end they pushed her out. But she had grown throughout those whole 11 years better and better and better. What is her historic achievement? I suppose a woman becoming Prime Minister in such a powerful situation. Maybe there were other women prime ministers in places like Ceylon and like that, but in one of the members of the Security Council in the United Nations, they now had a woman that was leading this. And she didn't, as Robin said, she didn't get that because of some special provision in the law that said half the cabinet has to be women. She got that because she was good, because she was better. There was a little bit of luck, and talking to someone just the other day made me realize that instinctively the British were not against women leaders. Why? Well, when we look back in our history and we look to the queens that we had, probably 1 out of 6 wasn't very good. But generally speaking, they were better than the men. So, why would we object to having a woman in the top job? So we'd had experience of women being in the top job in terms of the Constitution. So that was a little bit of luck as well. Finally, that's probably the most important thing in which she did. She advanced feminism by ability. And that is really a very important thing. You get to the top by ability, not because you're this sex or that sex, or you know him or you know her or whatever. Just finally, that's John reminding me of that, because when when Loisa Pettele came to London and Mrs. Thatcher wasn't available, she said he should meet Sir Percy Craddock, this is John referred to, because he was the chairman of the, what was it called, a joint...
the Joint Intelligence.
Yeah. And he had his fingers on all the intelligence that was going on in Europe, in the Cold War, in the Western Alliance and so on. And she knew that it was important that Loisa Pettele spoke to him. And so Loisa went to number 10 Downing Street and they had a long conversation. For me, I felt rather pleased about that because it sort of showed that the efforts that many of us have been making, myself, Robin and others, that Downing Street listened to Slovenia, listened to Croatia, and also, of course, Bosnia and Macedonia. So with that sort of final little anecdote, thank you very much.